Douglas Goold. Dr. Goold is going to be discussing a very innovative and informative talk tonight. His research on the Canada-India economic relationship, which is not only timely, but prescient. Now, Dr. Gould's research is informative, it's going to be illuminating, as you'll find. And I say this not because I know Dr. Gould, having met him a couple of years ago in India, but I say it because Dr. Gould is researching the rise of the Canada-India economic relationship at a time where the two countries are coming together in a way that they haven't over the past 50-odd years. Indeed, it's a dynamic period right now between the two countries, and Doug is filling a notable void in a topic that's often neglected by the media and by Canadian academics. So it's with that I'd like to welcome Dr. Gould tonight. And first I'll read a little bit about his accomplished background. Dr. Gould has just been named Senior Editor of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Prior to that, he was a Senior Fellow with the CIC. And of course, many of us will recognize Dr. Gould as being past President of the CIC, as well as its predecessor, the Canadian Institute of International Affairs. Dr. Gould is also a well-known commentator, an author and the former editor of the Globe and Mail Report on Business magazine and the Globe and Mail Report on Business. He is also known as a longtime national columnist. Dr. Gould is also co-author of numerous books, including Peace Without Promise, a book on the peace settlement after the First World War, The Bre-X Fraud, which was a national #1 bestseller, and he has written a book on Canada's banks. He recently completed his study for the CIC entitled Doing Business in India: Success, Failure, and the Prospects for Canada. This spring he appeared before the Standing Committee of the Senate on Foreign Affairs on the rise of Russia, India, and China to discuss his research and his findings. Doug, on a beautiful summer's evening that's not quite as warm as New Delhi, I'd like to welcome you here this evening to talk to the CIC branch about your work, and please let us give a warm welcome to Dr. Doug Gould.
Thanks so much, Ryan, and it's wonderful to see a great crowd out here on a beautiful night, so bless you for coming out. Somebody just mentioned they were in Delhi and it was 48 degrees, so if you think this is hot, you don't really know hot. I'd like to thank the executive, and Joan in particular, of the Waterloo branch, the very successful Waterloo branch of the Canadian International Council, and also CG, whose beautiful building this is for hosting this event. And it's great to see so many people in this audience and so many people that I know from various incarnations. As Ryan mentioned, I've just been named the senior editor of the Vancouver-based Asia Pacific Foundation, and I hope that, and I'm representing them in this part of the country, and I hope that in future Asia Pacific will be able to cooperate on various events, maybe some publications, maybe some speakers in this part of the country, both CG and the CIC. It's a small country, and I think that the more capacity we have on Asia, and India in particular, the better it will be. So as Ryan mentioned, there's a couple of things I've done recently, 2 projects. I've written the South Asia part of a CIC book that's going to be published by the University of Toronto Press later this year, entitled Canada's National Security Strategy, Interests and Threats. And if you look at South Asia on the map, you can understand why it's become so important. You have Pakistan in one direction, you have China in another direction, you've got the nuclear question, you've got concerns about terrorism, you have all the major food groups, and you've also got Afghanistan, which I'll turn to later. And I'm actually going to talk about both India from an economic point of view and also the geopolitics of India, where India stands in the world scheme of things. And one other thing, the study I did, which is on Canadian companies that do business in India, I'm thinking of one of my next projects, maybe apart from more research on India, to do the same thing on one of the other BRIC countries, BRIC being Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And the country I would probably do is Brazil. There's China, 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 China. There's a vast amount of research. India is relatively under-researched. Brazil is definitely under-researched. Russia, to be honest, not that many people seem to care about. And I'm going to talk a little about the BRIC later on. Speaking of globalization, to show what a small world it is, I was in India for the entire month of November, and I had been interviewing Canadian and Indian executives here. And I was sitting in the office of a woman named Shirley Townsend, who's Ontario's representative. She's actually in the embassy in New Delhi. And she was saying, how are your interviews going? And I said, well, they're going pretty well, but some people are hard to get a hold of. And she said, well, who would that be? And I said, well, even from my days at the Globe and Mail, I know that, Magna never liked to talk to the journalists and, don't seem to be very forthcoming on my project. And I see there's another company called R.V. Anderson that is doing, they're actually redoing the wastewater system in Mumbai, a huge job. And I'd contacted the CEO a number of times. His name's Ken Morrison, never heard anything back. This is in New Delhi, the very day I arrived. And she said, well, would you like to meet him? And I said, of course I'd like to meet him. And she said, well, do you want me to go get him? He's in the next office. And I said, what's he doing in the next office? And she said, oh, he's on a trade mission. So she lugs this guy in, who looked kind of shamefaced because he hadn't been answering my emails. And I said, oh, Mr. Morrison, great to see you. When can we have an interview? So I trapped him. So I was very pleased that took place. The study I did basically was based on the idea that people for years have said Canada and India should be natural partners, but they never have been. Much of that is because of the nuclear question, which I'll talk about a little later. And trade is not what it's been. Investment between the two countries has not been what it's been. So I said, well, has anyone actually talked to Canadians that have gone, Canadian companies that have gone to India and been successful? Nobody had. So what I ended up doing was talking to people from Scotiabank that have been there for 20 years, people from Royal Bank that's setting up there, people from Brookfield Asset Management, which is an $80 billion Canadian company that now have someone there, 30 or 40 or 50 different Canadian companies, and looked at their experience of what is it like to set up a business in India, what are the problems, what are the opportunities, how do you deal with the government, what would you like our government to do, and what's the business culture like there? I mean, how do you work deals, how bad is corruption, you have to pay people off, and all of this was done on the record, which no one else has done, and I've got great stories in this study that I hope will soon be published by the CIC about people being offered bribes and how they react, and all kinds of stories. I was amazed at the candor of so many people on subjects that are normally considered very sensitive. I would say the good news is there's a lot of interest in India. I was surprised. I've spoken at, in the last 6 or 8 weeks at McGill University in Montreal, at a conference in Ottawa, an event in Toronto, a CIC event in Toronto, in Edmonton and Calgary, and at UBC. And also was fortunate enough, Ryan mentioned this, to present in front of the Canadian Senate's Foreign Affairs Committee, which is doing something on what they called RIC rather than BRIC. RIC is Russia, India, and China. And actually, if anyone's really interested in pursuing any of these issues, the testimony is quite fascinating. Ramesh Thakur, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, gave particularly good testimony just a few weeks ago, just before my modest contribution, and I would highly recommend that anyone who's really interested in the subject have a look at what they had to say. So let me tell you what I want to cover tonight. I think it'll take about 35 minutes, and the reason I'm giving you the time, when I worked at the Globe and Mail, if any of you read Margaret Wente's column, she used to be my boss. Remember, she was once sent on a management training course at vast expense somewhere in the States, and she came back, and I said to her, what did you learn? And she said, I learned one thing. If you want to have a good meeting, tell people in advance how long it's going to be so they don't get bored. So if I go on more than 35 minutes or 40 minutes at the most, get the hook and I'll get off the stage. So what I want to talk about, first of all, is India's potential. Some of this will be obvious to people that know India well, but not so obvious to others. Secondly, I want to assess that potential. Thirdly, I want to look very briefly at India's problems, which are apparent to most people. Fourthly, Canada-India relations, again very briefly, and Dr. Chewy is an expert on that, so I hope he doesn't start waving his fist at me. Number 5, doing business in India, which was what my study was about. And lastly, I think also in the title it said business and security, or business and geopolitics. I want to look at the question of whether India is a world power. So let's begin by looking at India's potential and why India is important. I mean, the first thing I would say is 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, you'd never get this many people to hear a speech on India, particularly on a night when the weather's so good. And in fact, I think if you look back not very many years, when people thought of India, if they thought of India at all, they thought of a hot, poverty-stricken country that got a lot of aid from countries like Canada. Well, India is still hot, 48 degrees in New Delhi. There is still 500 million people, or however many it is, that live on $1 or $2 a day, so poverty and inequality are still big issues. But it doesn't get as much aid as it used to. And in fact, it was India that cut off CETA, the Canadian International Development Agency, a couple of years ago, and said, we don't want any more of your bilateral aid. And in fact, India, far from just being a recipient of aid in 2011, gives more than $1 billion alone to Afghanistan in aid. And the big circular road in Afghanistan going around the country is largely built and financed by India. So things have changed a lot. I would say the first reason why India is on our radar screens and why we care is that for many decades there was something called the Hindu rate of growth. It may have been the result of Nehru's socialistic view of economics and other factors, but growth for many decades was between 3 and 3.5%. Starting in the 1980s, growth picked up a lot, went from 3% to 6%, and then for many years was up around 9%. So it basically was the second fastest growing large country in the world behind China. And it also has done much better through this last recession than most other powers. One interesting observation is if you look at the emerging world, the southern hemisphere, it's done relatively better than Europe and North America through the recession of 2008-2009. And of course, India ended the so-called License Raj in 1991. And if you look at that, so the economy started to liberalize about 20 years ago, which is about a half a generation after China started to liberalize, which, you know, the signature date for China is 1978-79. The signature date for reform in India is 1991. And the reforms in 1991 were actually prompted by a balance of payments crisis. And interestingly enough, the two of the key people at the time that were responsible for India's reform in 1991 were Manmohan Singh, who is now the Prime Minister, and Mantek Singh Ahluwalia, who is currently the head of the powerful Planning Commission. So the two people 20 years ago that provided the reforms and the opening up of India are still in positions of huge power in India. And it's been remarked the average age in India now is an incredible 25 years old, but it's run by a gerontocracy, that the politicians are old, but the population as a whole are young. And on a purchasing power parity basis, India now, you can measure this different ways, is about the 4th largest economy in the world and the 4th largest consuming country in the world once you adjust for currencies. And it's generally thought that sometime over the next few decades, India will pass China as the most populous country in the world. I think it's now China's about 1.3 billion people, India's 1.1 billion. India, given current trends, is going to catch up. I think the second reason that India is important and on our radar screens is because of its geopolitical importance, particularly in the wake of the civilian so-called 1-2-3 agreement which was forged by President George W. Bush. That was effectively an acceptance for the first time by the United States of India as a nuclear power. So you might want to know, why did the United States go from condemning India for its nuclear tests in 1974 and 1998 to accepting India as a nuclear power, not to mention selling it high-tech weapons and conducting joint exercises in the Indian Ocean? I think there are three reasons for this. So this is the geopolitics of it. I think the first reason was economic. The United States wanted to sell nuclear reactors and nuclear services to the huge Indian market. I think the second reason was geopolitical, and this was an unstated reason, that if you look at a map of the world and you look on one side of India, you see, or you look on one side of India, you see China, and you look at the other side, you see Pakistan. I think the US was worried about China's military buildup, particularly naval, and wanted a counterweight. So the United States had allies in the form of Japan and Korea on one side, and they wanted to balance the power on the other side, and they chose India. And finally, I think this was prompted to a large extent by the US diaspora, Indo-Americans. And what is interesting is that the US Indian diaspora is proportionally smaller than the Canadian diaspora, but they have a lot more power. And the question might be, why is that the case? That's a whole different subject, but I would say the basic reason is the Canadian Indo-diaspora, which is 1 million people, or South Asians, 1 million people out of 33 million, they're split geographically, largely between Toronto and Vancouver, and they're split in terms of their view of the world. There's a lot of Gujaratis, there's a lot of Sikhs. The Sikhs are divided, as we saw recently in Brampton, so they don't act as effectively as the US diaspora. Now, what about Canada on this geopolitical issue? Canada has been at was at loggerheads with India for years on the nuclear question. And without going into this long subject, an important subject, India had its first nuclear test in 1974, and they clearly benefited from Canadian technology. So Canada felt betrayed. There was another test, or tests, in 1998, and Lloyd Axworthy was the foreign minister and reacted very strongly, in a very negative way. And if you actually read the press release, if you want to see diplomacy at its most extreme, you would be hard-pressed to write a press release that was stronger than what Lloyd Axworthy issued in 1998. So from 74 to 98 and following, you had what David Malone, a former High Commissioner to India, told me was a 30-year mutual sulk between the two countries. So relations were put on ice, what might have been a natural partnership because of the past Commonwealth connection, the past British connection. We're both democracies, we both use English. You would think we'd be natural partners, but that never really happened. And I think the leading reason for that was this nuclear question. In 2008, a major reversal took place, and Canada was a key member of what's called the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which is 45 countries which have some degree of nuclear capacity that have to agree unanimously to any changes. And Canada agreed with the rest of the Nuclear Suppliers Group to give India an exemption to the group's export restrictions. So Canada basically was following what the United States had done, and to flip it around, and I know Dr. Chewy has written about this, if we hadn't done that, we would have very much upset the Indians, and we would very much have upset the United States. So, you know, it's a tough world out there, folks. I think we did what we had to do. And I think this was one of the most important foreign policy events of the last at least 10 years, and least reported. And if you want to look at it from an inside baseball point of view, There were divisions within the Canadian government about this decision about dropping their opposition to India as a nuclear power. There was opposition from the Department of Foreign Affairs, DFAIT, but the exemption, that is basically agreeing with what India wanted to do, was successfully lobbied within the Conservative government by the Prime Minister himself, Stephen Harper, by Stockwell Day, and by David Emerson. This is not public information, but that's certainly what I've heard. And then late last year, in 2009, Canada announced it had signed a nuclear cooperation agreement with India. Not surprisingly, companies such as Atomic Energy Corporation Limited and Saskatoon-based Cameco, which mines uranium, pressed for a nuclear agreement with India. And according to people that I've spoken to who are familiar with the negotiations, this is kind of, I think, interesting, a nuclear deal between Canada and India had been held up for a number of months by two key concerns. The first one, which may sound trivial, but I think is quite interesting, was the question of visas. Indian scientists wanted visas to come to Canada on the nuclear question. And Canada's concern was, are these civilian scientists or are they military scientists? Are they going to come here to learn from us so they can build bigger and better bombs? And the Indian reality basically was, you know what? They're the same people. They eat in the same cafeteria. There was no clear separation between civilian and nuclear, so India basically said, get lost. If we're going to have an agreement, you have to agree to this. And the second interesting and serious concern was simply the worry that if an agreement between Canada and India went ahead, the Indians might undertake another nuclear test. So what's the point of having nuclear weapons if you can't try them out? And maybe, just maybe, if relations were particularly bad between India and Pakistan, India might want to have a little display to flex their muscles. So that was an issue that stood in the way, but I don't, as far as I know, the terms of the nuclear cooperation agreement between the two countries have not yet been announced, but they're going to be. I think the third reason India is on our radar screen in 2011, and it wasn't 10 years ago, is because it's a so-called BRIC country. BRIC being Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the concept that was created by Goldman Sachs in the year 2000 and published in 2001. And the BRIC countries and the whole concept of BRIC as high-growth emerging economies has received huge worldwide attention over the last 6 or 7 or 8 years. What is important, if you've heard this concept, what is important to recognize is that Goldman Sachs didn't evaluate emerging economies. It just chose the 4 biggest emerging economies in 2000, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And those 4 countries, 11 years later, are still the 4 biggest economies. So it didn't say Brazil has or India have better prospects than Mexico or Indonesia or South Africa. Goldman Sachs simply said the economies are bigger. And in my view, it's an odd grouping, and some people say there's 2 bricks in the wall, and the bricks are China, 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 followed by India. The other 2 don't matter. My own view, which some people disagree with, is that the odd person out here is Russia. I mean, how many people see Russia as a country of the future? I don't. Russia is a former superpower that relies largely on commodities in a kind of thuggish way. It has a terrible demographics, a declining population, and not really a lot once you get by oil, gas, and minerals. Not that those aren't important. So here's a simple question. When's the last time you bought a good Russian product? Let me change that. When's the last time you bought a Russian product? And my own answer is, I think I bought a bottle of vodka for New Year's in 1995 and some caviar to go with it. I was at a BRIC conference, again that acronym, a year ago in Vancouver, And the person who dreamt up that concept from Goldman Sachs, Jim O'Neill, was there. So what I cruelly commented at the conference was, why should we pay any attention to what Goldman Sachs says? They didn't see the biggest, how good is their prediction ability? They didn't see the biggest recession since the 1930s coming, and they took a $10 billion loan from the US government to help bail them out. So who the hell cares what they think? Just being nasty. I've lost a page here. Be that as it may, Taran Das, who is the longtime head, he's just resigned from the powerful Confederation of Indian Industries, told me in November in New Delhi, the BRIC concept, the concept dreamt up by Goldman Sachs, has helped put India on the map for a lot of people all around the world. So that's why it's up there. Let me turn to an assessment then of that potential that I've outlined. So I'm going to give you some examples that you remember. People never remember data. You can talk about growth rates and so on. But this is the sort of thing I think people it'll stick in their mind. So the first question is, just to give you a sense of the size of the Indian market, how many cell phone subscribers do you think Indian telecom companies signed up for the single month of January 2010? So new subscribers for cell phones in India for 1 month. Does anybody have any idea? 10 million? Anybody else have an idea? 1 month, 31 days. 19.1 million people in 1 month. And it's the second biggest market in the world after China, and I think the number is now of cell phone subscribers is something like 650 million, and cell phones cost less than a penny a minute. And you think, a penny? I mean, how could you make a living out of that? Well, the biggest carriers now have 80 to 100 million customers, so you can do the math when you're driving home. If you add up those pennies and you've got that number of customers, that's a lot of dough. I'm going to give you a second example of how big the Indian market is. So one of the people I interviewed was Kevin Doherty, who is the president of Sun Life Financial, the big insurance company. And in India, the company's branded, the name of it is Birla, B-I-R-L-A, Sun Life. And the Birla family is one of the oldest and most respected names in the country. So Kevin told me that Sun Life has been operating in Canada for 140 years and in India for only 9 years. They were actually kicked out in the 50s, but came back. So they've only been there really this time around for 9 years. So he said after only 9 years, this is a Canadian company, Sun Life sells 4 times as much life insurance in India as it does in Canada. After 140 years, Sun Life employs, think of this number, 3,500 advisors across Canada. So 140 years, 3,500 advisors. After 9 years, Sun Life employs 160,000 advisors in India. I'll give you one final statistic. So anyone who's been to India for 5 minutes knows infrastructure is a problem. The roads are not very good, the airports are not very good, the ports are not very good, though the airports in particular are getting better. And the government of India knows it's a problem and has made infrastructure a priority. So again, the numbers are staggering. In the Planning Commission's 11th 5-year plan, which goes to 2012, the government estimates spending on infrastructure at $517 billion US, more than $500 billion. And we had recently in Toronto the highways minister, whose name is Kamal Nath, and he said he's obviously in charge of highways. He said his goal, starting this June, next month, is to pave 20 kilometers of highway in India a day. 20 kilometers a day. That's a lot of road. So the opportunity it's no wonder Canadian engineering companies and the SSE Lavalins and the Bombardier, by the way, is doing the metro, the subway cars for the new expanded metro in New Delhi. So there are huge, huge opportunities. Now, I would say alongside this potential, India has many advantages, and I'm not a cheerleader here, but most of these are obvious, so I won't go through them. Widespread use of English, and you might, in the back of your mind, compare some of these to China. Widespread use of English, the rule of law, strong entrepreneurial culture, expertise in information technology, a free press, and a vibrant, if flawed, democracy. 700 million Indians voted in last year's presidential election. There's also what's been called the demographic dividend. Kamal Nath, when he was here, you know that most of Europe, Japan, Russia, and North America, everyone's talking about the boomers or the zoomers or whatever. People are getting older. The average age in India already is 25. And you think it's both an opportunity and a problem. The problem is you have to employ these people, and there's something like 30 million people coming on the market every year or 2 years, like a huge number of people that need jobs. The opportunity is younger people tend to be more dynamic, they tend to be more plugged into technology, they tend to be more entrepreneurial, they're more willing to take chances. And on entrepreneurship, anyone who arrives in Delhi airport will know within a few minutes that about the entrepreneurial spirit. Everyone's selling something, everyone's hawking something, everyone's making something, however poor. And it's amazing how well people do with so little. And that's not to discount the huge problems of poverty. So you will find there's the airport taxi driver who kindly drives you not to your destination, but straight to their brother-in-law's gift shop for wonderful bargains, even if you don't want to go there. Let's look briefly at India's problems. I think, as I said, anybody who's been in India for 5 minutes can see the problems. The disparity in wealth still remains enormous. There's hundreds of millions of people living in dire poverty. The government, you don't need to point this out to them, they're aware of this. And their number one goal is inclusive growth. So if you look at the Planning Commission's booklets, they're entitled, the subtitle is Inclusive Growth. And here's another thing that I think can stick in your mind in terms of statistics. India has about 45 times the population of Canada, but only a slightly larger gross domestic product. And India's GDP, since the comparisons are always made in India and elsewhere to China, China's GDP is almost 3 times the size of India's. Finally, in the land of problems, India does poorly on most international rankings, whether they're from the UN, the World Bank, whether you're looking at global competitiveness, corruption, or human development. So here's a kind of telling example. The UN Development Programme's Human Development Index, which attempts to assess a broad definition of well-being, on it, India is ranked 134th, just ahead of Congo, the so-called Democratic Republic of Congo, and Myanmar, and far behind the other BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, and China. Let me turn briefly to Canada-India relations. I mentioned the nuclear issue and my own view that Canada's prissy attitude was a mistake. Not that I believe nuclear weapons are a good thing, obviously they're not. But India was a nuclear power, and I think the mature way to handle it is to recognize that and to work with it. And in my view, Canada and India should have agreed to disagree and got on with other things, but they didn't. That relations were frozen to a large extent for more than 30 years. We went into a big sulk and missed partnering with an important country on many other areas, which was particularly unfortunate given the huge Indo-Canadian diaspora here and the natural partnership between the two countries. The good news, I think, is that the nuclear issue appears finally to be off the table, and we can start to work together in areas such as education, energy, and the environment. So Ryan and I, in 2008, went with a group from the Asia Pacific Foundation to India. And we were trying to look at whether there were areas in which the two countries could cooperate. So we looked at Afghanistan, education, and energy and the environment. First, on Afghanistan, you'd think we could come to some sort of cooperative agreement there. India very much supports Western and NATO efforts to bring stability to Afghanistan, which is not far from India. But cooperation, the message we got, cooperation was a non-starter. And we were told bluntly by the head of a prominent think tank in Delhi that NATO got itself into a mess in Afghanistan, and NATO could get itself out of that mess. It's your problem, you deal with it. Education, however, looked more promising, and again, Dr. Chewy is the expert on that. And he's researched effectively how effectively the US, Britain, and Australia have marketed themselves in India. Well, Canada, until recently, has done very little. That's starting to change because there's many delegations from Canada and from University of Canada to India on what we can do in terms of student exchanges, faculty exchanges, scholarships, and so on. And Dr. Chewy has called for, I shouldn't be speaking for him, but a federally funded program to develop higher education linkages with India. This is a CIC study that he did a year or so ago. Linkages with India that promote student recruitment and research partnerships and the funding of scholarships. I think lastly, there are also opportunities between the two countries in energy and environment. And Ontario Premier Dalton McGuinty went to India in last December, and he focused on what Ontario can do in terms of renewable energy and environment with India. And the company I mentioned, RV Anderson, whose CEO was forced to undergo an interview on my hands, is designing and helping to rebuild the vast wastewater system in Mumbai. I think that India's nuclear energy needs are vast. There's a growing gap between, if you look at the supply and the demand curve is going up, the supply curve is pretty flat, and they really have to rely upon either poor coal or more nuclear or renewables. Let me turn briefly to doing business in India. The interesting thing is not even the Indian government pretends it's easy to do business in India. And you know what? It isn't. There's the legendary red tape, there's crumbling infrastructure, there's corruption, and brutal competition in most sectors. But as we've seen, there's also enormous potential. There's some remarkable stories of Canadian business successes in India. I mentioned Sun Life Financial, doing so well just over a short period of time. So how many people know, you know McCain's Food that produces frozen French fries, the biggest producer of frozen French fries in the world? So I interviewed their head here, their international head in Toronto, and I interviewed their head in Delhi. And they spent 8 years in Gujarat state talking to farmers and persuading them to grow the perfect potato for French fries. And who knew what the perfect potato for French fries was? It has to be oblong shape. I didn't know this until I talked to them, so the French fries are long enough. And it has to have a starch content of 21 to 22%, so it's not too watery or too dry. So the result was Canada's $6 billion food company is now the 100% supplier of frozen French fries to McDonald's in India, and exports products like tandoori veggie nuggets, the ultimate party snack, from India, this is a Canadian company, to Malaysia, the Middle East, South Africa, the UK, and potentially also back to Canada. So you have a Canadian company in India with a factory in Gujarat producing potatoes for so-called ethnic snacks, that's their term, that they're going to sell back to Canada. So I was sitting talking to the country manager, and he had a poster up behind him, and I said, do you mind if I take that? I don't know whether you can see it, but here it is. Alotiki, McCain's, and here's another one. Tandoori Veggie Nuggets, a Canadian company with the McCain symbol, that are sold all over India. So my conclusion on that is that corporate Canada, which tends to be very risk-averse, as I learned at the Globe and Mail, has traditionally showing little interest in India, but that's changing. And one of the best signs is that the smart money has moved in. There's lots of dumb companies out there, but there's a few smart ones. One of them is right here, Research in Motion. So they have been in India successfully for a number of years. They had that patent issue, but that seems to have been resolved. So we now have Fairmont hotels, you know, the Fairmont Royal York and Fairmonts all across Canada. They're throughout Asia, but they're opening, I think, 4 hotels this year in India for the first time. Brookfield Asset Management, whose assets are something like $80 billion, looking at real estate opportunities, infrastructure opportunities, energy opportunities. And I literally sat with their country head, or the person they have representing them there, on the bay in Bombay, on the top floor of the Oberoi Hotel, looking out as he was talking about deals that they might try to consummate. So Research in Motion, Fairmont, and apparently Power Corporation, which is also smart money, the Desmarais family out of Montreal that's been successful in China. They're one of the first companies going back to the early 80s that went to China, have been very successful. They're now looking at India. Alongside that, India is a priority of the federal government, which you might say is a mixed blessing, and the Export Development Canada, EDC, funding for 2008 was $1.7 billion. So they're funding a lot of corporate activity in India. And of course, India, from its point of view, has opened up enormously since 1991, as I mentioned, and since the reforms and the election in 2008 of Prime Minister Singh. He has a stronger mandate than he had before, so one hopes that the reform process will continue. So basically, the big arrow points up. The last thing I'd like to look at, and this again is on the security side of things and the geopolitical side of things, is India's role in the world. By any measure, India is the largest South Asian power. But it's not clear if it will become a global power or even wants to be one. It's an important regional power. It's critical vis-a-vis Afghanistan. It's critical vis-a-vis Pakistan. It's critical vis-a-vis Bangladesh. And it is recently, or is acquiring, the ultimate symbol of global power. And what would that be? Does anyone know? If you want to show yourself off to the world, what do you buy? Or what do you build? An aircraft carrier, that's right. But it doesn't seem clear either to the Indians or anyone else what a global India would look like. India is certainly the centerpiece of security in South Asia. And in my view, it's clearly by far the most stable power in a very dangerous neighborhood. If you just look at the nuclear powers, they're in all directions. Just look at a map. India, Pakistan, China, and with Iran, a wannabe nuclear power. And India also has the advantage not just of stability, but being the most established democracy in Asia. So in my view, the Canadian government should support India whenever it can in international fora. Whether it's in the G20, which is coming to Toronto. In fact, I'm getting kicked out of my building for that week in June. They told us, the University of Toronto is just shut down for the week, decided to shut down amidst much controversy. And we're basically told probably best not to show up at the office that week. Anyway, I think we should support India when we can in the G20 and other fora. And I think we should support India's long-time desire to be a member of the UN Security Council. And here I will sound a bit like Machiavelli. One of the reasons I would support it, I'd support it for 2 reasons. One, I think it's right. If you had to add a 6th permanent member of the Security Council, what country would you choose? If you could only choose one, and I think most people would choose India ahead of Brazil or Japan or Germany or whatever. And the second thing is, the slightly more cynical reason is, I think the chances of the Security Council being expanded are precisely 0. So you're offering something that's never going to be realized. Let me look briefly at India and China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. So India and China, which have become major trading partners, have a wary diplomatic relationship. They fought a war in 1962 over their northeast border and remain in disagreement over that border. Relations with traditional rival Pakistan are particularly unfortunate. And I was at a high-level private conference on Ditchley near Oxford 2 years ago, interestingly enough attended by the head of the ISI, the much-hated intelligence operation, attended by the ISI chief who overthrew Benazir Bhutto's government. And there was a real sense, this is 2 years ago, of optimism. There have been a number of what are called confidence-building measures. You may remember this, renewal of bus travel between India and Pakistan. There was a cricket match, and there was even apparently backstairs progress on Kashmir, which is even older than the Palestinian issue. It's been going on for more than 50 years. All of that progress, unfortunately, was undermined by the events of November 26, 2008, when you had that brazen terrorist attack on Mumbai. It undermined that progress, and it was obviously one of the main motives for the attack was to undermine the progress that India and China were making. I was in Mumbai in November of last year for the first anniversary of 26/11. I was actually at the Taj Hotel, which was bombed. And the mood there was one of anger towards Pakistan for its sponsorship of terrorism. That the attackers of 26/11 came from Pakistani territory. The unknown question is to what extent, if any, were they supported directly or indirectly by the Pakistani government, but nonetheless they were based in Pakistan. And I wrote a piece about it in the National Post last December. And what I asked was, I wondered whether or not India would continue to show restraint if there were further terrorist incidents that had their roots, or appeared to have their roots, in Pakistan. Last November I had lunch with a high-level business person at the swanky Imperial Hotel in New Delhi, and casually mentioned to him that I understood he grew up in Pakistan. He looked alarmed and replied, "I don't tell where I come from to people here. And to me it's very worrisome if you won't say who you are to other people or are afraid of the reaction. So that is a problem." I also had an off-the-record talk with a well-known Indian with international experience who told me that if there was another incident that appeared to be motivated by Pakistan, he would support, this is a person in a position of very considerable power, he would support graduated, this is what he said, he would support graduated military action against Pakistan, beginning with bombing the ports and moving on to army headquarters. So I leave it to your imagination to decide where such action could lead. Finally, let me just turn very quickly to India and Afghanistan, and I have visited Afghanistan with the Canadian troops a couple of years ago. There's a proxy war between India and Pakistan in Afghanistan. A proxy war between the two of them. So that's one of the main reasons why we've never seen Indian troops in Afghanistan. The Indians realized the kind of reaction it would produce in Pakistan. But as I said, despite the money and the development work that India is doing in Afghanistan, they don't seem to particularly want to move forward with any cooperation with Canada. And I'll end on that by adding a personal note, which really is not necessarily germane to the talk, but I was, I guess, a cautious optimist towards Canada's involvement in Afghanistan And my assessment today is it's going to end badly, whatever anybody does. And my sense is, and I hope I'm wrong, that the minute the Allies pull out, NATO and its allies, Afghanistan will revert to the same sort of warfare we saw, intertribal warfare, before the Taliban arrived. So there's been 30 years, more than 30 years of war in Afghanistan, and regrettably, I don't see that ending, but I don't see any easy alternative to Canada's withdrawal in 2011. I hope that we maintain some sort of presence. I hope we continue to do development work. I hope we continue, and we may not, to train soldiers and the police, which badly need training, but I don't think it's going to end well. So let me end by summarizing what I hope has been apparent from what I've said. First of all, with the nuclear issue out of the way, I think that relations between Canada and India have improved and will continue to improve. And I hope it will move beyond rhetoric towards a sustained focus on India and other emerging economies. I think one of the problems is, partly because of minority governments, there's a lack of continuity in Canadian foreign policy. We say all the right things about the developing world, but we really never deliver. We don't spend the money, we don't have the commitment, and we don't follow through. And I hope that changes. And I say this, I'm nonpartisan, I'd say that of both political parties, both of the major political parties. Second, on the economy, I think India will do well. I think the reform process will continue very slowly, but India will not do as well as its most fervent supporters suggest. I think it just has too many problems. I think that, you can bet on India versus China 30 years out. On the political side, India is far ahead. They've got a democracy, they've got rule of law, all the things I mentioned, but they don't have the dynamism that China has, not to mention the authoritarian government that makes things happen. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is arguable. I would say it's not a good thing, but others might disagree. And lastly, I would say India will remain the strategic centerpiece of Asia, warily watching the Chinese in the Indian Ocean and demanding that Pakistan control terrorist elements that cross into Afghanistan or India itself. And I would say, if you look around the globe, there is no more worrisome hotspot than that. I would say it's far more serious than the Palestinian question that goes on year after year, and everyone thinks it's going to fall apart, and fortunately it doesn't quite. But I would say India, Pakistan, both nuclear powers, India's sense that it's been very patient in dealing with the terrorist attacks and government sponsorship of the Taliban and of terrorist forces. I think if there's another incident, it could end very badly. So finally, on the economic front, my study recommends 4 things, which I'll just give you very quickly. I think we need greater engagement from the Prime Minister on down. It took Stephen Harper an enormous length of time to go to India or China, and it's not a surprise that the Chinese Premier chewed him out publicly for not going there earlier. We have to recognize the world has changed. We're not the power we once was. People are lining up 50 deep to talk to people in India and China. We're towards the end of a very long queue, and we need to realize that. Secondly, I think good politics and good business go hand in hand, and we need more sustained, we need a sustained improvement in relations. I mentioned because the nuclear question's gone, things are improving, they need to continue to improve. Thirdly, I think we need clarity on the nuclear question. Who knows what's going to happen to AECL or our own nuclear industry? If we want it to be an important part of the Ontario economy, we need to do something about it. And we're not going to sell, if we can't even buy reactors ourselves, which we appear not to be able to do, we're not going to sell them to anybody else. Now that's, of course, a debatable question. There's the military dimension, there's the future of nuclear power, but if we want to have a place at the table on the nuclear question, we've got to straighten things out. And lastly, and this is another big subject which I won't go into, we need stronger branding, not just in India, but around the world for Canada and elsewhere. So thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming out on a hot night, and I'd be delighted to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Goold, for these thoughtful insights. And for those of you who have questions, as Doug has just indicated, he'll happily answer them. There are microphones on either side of the atrium. Sorry, okay, so right there. So please feel free to answer or ask Doug any questions, and I'll turn it over to you.
Looking at the chronological time frame of India getting started after China,
Right.
if you take that lag time and look at where they are now versus where China is now, where's the supply chain and materials and labor force or raw materials going to come to fuel in every sense of the way the explosion that may be coming in the next 10 years in India, for India to get to the next step on the ladder, such as China?
I think that's a good question. I mean, one thing I didn't touch upon is the economies are essentially different. I mean, China has become the workshop of the world. It's a productivity-based model. They're a huge exporter. India isn't the same. India doesn't export nearly so much. They're not nearly as connected to the global economy, and actually that was an advantage during the recession because they were largely protected from the rest of the world. The advantage they have is they've got this huge consumer market, and they have a middle class that's variously estimated, from a bottom of 50 million people, which is 1.5 times the entire population of Canada, to you sometimes hear 300 or 400 million people. So the economy is more inward looking. They're not going to need as much help from the rest of the world as China needs. And of course, China is famous for all the commodities they consume, for their global presence. Africa is very well known, where they're doing deals with African countries, largely to get access to commodities. What is a little less known is they're doing exactly the same thing in Latin America. So will India, need more of the rest of the world, including Canada? Yes, I think so, and there are opportunities there, as I specified. Will they need as much of the rest of the world as China? No, they won't.
I think it was recently, like within the last few months, I read India now possesses the capability to destroy satellites from the ground, right? The anti-satellite technology. And I think those actions, for obvious reasons, might agitate Pakistan. And just going back to what you said about Canada needing to support India in international forums, I wondered what you thought Canada's response could be to that continued push towards India's declared intentions with space.
I don't know. I didn't. What you say is very interesting. I wasn't really aware of it. I mean, I think, Canada can be supportive, but it doesn't have to be supportive of everything. A partnering country can be, a friend can be. But I think if you look at the options in South Asia, some might say there's not a lot to choose, and India is overwhelmingly the best of the choices. But that having been said, I think if you're friends with a country, friends can disagree, and you can say what you're doing, on the security side or military side or whatever it may be, we don't agree with. But as with the nuclear question, I think the mature thing to do is to say, we agree to disagree, and we're going to move on other issues. So anyway, thank you for your question. Yep. The question is if I could comment on rapid population growth, and does the Indian government have a position on it? Well, the sort of view of India we have from the olden days, where there would be 9 kids or whatever, that largely has ended. And I think Rajiv Gandhi in the 1980s, they had a policy of enforced sterilization, which lasted for a while. There was a lot of public opposition. There was a lot of international opposition. That policy has ended. Families now, I'm not an expert on demographics, but families now in India are much smaller. One of the ironies comparing them with China is the one-child policy has boomeranged around on China, and now they have an aging population, and that means the dependency ratio will change, exactly what's happening here, where, people like me in a few years, I hope, are going to all be sitting in the back garden with a gin and tonic, barking orders at hapless children to support me in my dotage. So the good news for a country like India is that's not going to happen. I don't know what their dependency ratio is, but it's going to be the reverse of what it is here, and even more so in Russia, to some extent in China. Japan has very bad demographics. So as I said, it's both an opportunity and a problem. You've got to give all those young people jobs, but you want that dynamism, and you want most of the people, the largest possible percentage of your population actually working, not living on pensions and paying taxes. The government's, I don't know what the government of India's position is on that, but the whole fabric of society has changed in the last couple of decades, for the better, I think. Thank you.
Dr. Goold, just wondering what's going to happen to India as far as global warming is concerned, pertaining specifically to water.
What's going to happen is the water's going to rise, and Bangladesh will flood, and it'll roll over India. I don't know, but there are real concerns, and I think water is rapidly becoming, in India and elsewhere, the % problem, almost greater than energy. I mentioned the energy problem. There's also an environmental side of that I didn't mention. 55% of their electricity is generated by high ash coal, which produces a lot of pollution. From what I've seen, the prognoses for possible environmental problems in India are, the possibility of them are quite high, and even worse in low-lying countries like Bangladesh. So I think they have a real problem, and I think they're aware of it. If you know any more than I do, please add it.
Just the only comment in regard to that is specifically drinking water, and enough water to irrigate their lands.
Enough water to?
Irrigate their lands.
I've seen charts of, available potable water and so on, and it's a real problem, and there's less water than there was, and I think farmers are not terribly efficient. So the efficiency level on the use of water has to increase, and if it doesn't, there's going to be an even greater problem than there is today. Thank you. Anybody else? Thank you very much. Thank you. It isn't, but I can put it on. Sure.
Good evening. My name is Joan Eiler. I'm president of the Waterloo Branch CIC, and it's my pleasure to thank Dr. Douglas Goold for being with us tonight. I've known Doug for over the years through CIA and CIC, and I just want to say thank you very much for your talk. Rather than go into a lot of detail about his analysis, I'd like to say that his paper, which he's just completed, will be available on the website, the Canadian International Council website. So please have a look over the next, Doug, when would you say, another week?
Soon, very soon.
Soon. And thanks again, Doug, for coming. And also to Dr. Toohey, Ryan Toohey, who is also a member of our branch here and is a prof at St. Jerome's University. Thanks again, Ryan. Just a couple of words about our branch. Our next event coming up is June 23rd. It is a group of foreign correspondents, Canadian foreign correspondents, who most of have been out in the mission, and we'll have one contact with someone who's posted in Afghanistan. There is a members' dinner prior to the public forum, which will be here in the atrium, and that's on the June 23rd at 7 o'clock. and our annual general meeting is scheduled for September. So you will be getting further notice about that, and thanks so much for coming tonight. And if you're not a member and you'd like to become a member, I'd encourage you to do so. Thank you.
University in Montreal, at a conference in Ottawa, an event in Toronto, a CIC event in Toronto, in Edmonton and Calgary, and at UBC. And also was fortunate enough, Ryan mentioned this, to present in front of the Canadian Senate's Foreign Affairs Committee, which is doing something on what they called RIC rather than BRIC. RIC is Russia, India, and China. And actually, if anyone's really interested in pursuing any of these issues, the testimony is quite fascinating. Rana Sarkar, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, gave particularly good testimony just a few weeks ago, just before my modest contribution, and I would highly recommend that anyone who's really interested in the subject have a look at what they had to say. So let me tell you what I want to cover tonight. I think it'll take about 35 minutes, and the reason I'm giving you the time, when I worked at the Globe and Mail, if any of you read Margaret Wente's column, she used to be my boss. Remember, she was once sent on a management training course at vast expense somewhere in the States, and she came back, and I said to her, "What did you learn?" And she said, "I learned one thing. If you want to have a good meeting, tell people in advance how long it's going to be so they don't get bored." So if I go on more than 35 minutes or 40 minutes at the most, get the hook and I'll get off the stage. So what I want to talk about, first of all, is India's potential. Some of this will be obvious to people that know India well, but not so obvious to others. Secondly, I want to assess that potential. Thirdly, I want to look very briefly at India's problems, which are apparent to most people. Fourthly, Canada-India relations, again very briefly, and Dr. Chewy is an expert on that, so I hope he doesn't start waving his fist at me. Number 5, doing business in India, which was what my study was about. And lastly,
Douglas Goold. Dr. Goold is going to be discussing a very innovative and informative talk tonight. His research on the Canada-India economic relationship, which is not only timely, but prescient. Now, Dr. Gould's research, it's informative, it's going to be illuminating, as you'll find. And I say this not because I know Dr. Gould, having met him a couple of years ago in India, but I say it because Dr. Gould is researching the rise of the Canada-India economic relationship at a time where the two countries are coming together in a way that they haven't over the past 50-odd years. Indeed, it's a dynamic period right now between the two countries, and Doug is filling a notable void in a topic that's often neglected by the media and by Canadian academics. So it's with that I'd like to welcome Dr. Gould tonight, and first I'll read a little bit about his accomplished background. Dr. Gould has just been named Senior Editor of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Prior to that, he was a Senior Fellow with the CIC, and of course many of us will recognize Dr. Gould as being past President of the CIC, as well as its predecessor, the Canadian Institute of International Affairs. Dr. Gould is also a well-known commentator, an author and the former editor of the Globe and Mail Report on Business magazine and the Globe and Mail Report on Business. He is also known as a longtime national columnist. Dr. Gould is also co-author of numerous books, including Peace Without Promise, a book on the peace settlement after the First World War, The Bre-X Fraud, which was a national #1 bestseller, and he has written a book on Canada's banks. He recently completed his study for the CIC entitled Doing Business in India, Success, Failure, and the Prospects for Canada. This spring he appeared before the Standing Committee of the Senate on Foreign Affairs on the rise of Russia, India, and China to discuss his research and his findings. Doug, on a beautiful summer's evening that's not quite as warm as New Delhi, I'd like to welcome you here this evening to talk to the CIC branch about your work, and please let us give a warm welcome to Dr. Doug Goold.
Thanks so much, Ryan, and it's wonderful to see a great crowd out here on a beautiful night, so bless you for coming out. Somebody just mentioned they were in Delhi and it was 48 degrees, so if you think this is hot, you don't really know hot. I'd like to thank the executive, and Joan in particular, of the Waterloo branch, the very successful Waterloo branch of the Canadian International Council, and also CG, whose beautiful building this is, for hosting this event. And it's great to see so many people in this audience and so many people that I know from various incarnations. As Ryan mentioned, I've just been named the senior editor of the Vancouver-based Asia Pacific Foundation, and I hope that, and I'm representing them in this part of the country, and I hope that in future Asia Pacific will be able to cooperate on various events, maybe some publications, maybe some speakers in this part of the country, both CG and the CIC. It's a small country, and I think that the more capacity we have on Asia and India in particular, the better it will be. So as Ryan mentioned, there's a couple of things I've done recently, 2 projects. I've written the South Asia part of a CIC book that's going to be published by the University of Toronto Press later this year, entitled Canada's National Security Strategy, Interests and Threats. And if you look at South Asia on the map, you can understand why it's become so important. You have Pakistan in one direction, you have China in another direction, you've got the nuclear question, you've got concerns about terrorism, you have all the major food groups, and you've also got Afghanistan, which I'll turn to later. And I'm actually going to talk about both India from an economic point of view and also the geopolitics of India, where India stands in the world scheme of things. And one other thing, the study I did, which is on Canadian companies that do business in India, I'm thinking of one of my next projects, maybe apart from more research on India, to do the same thing on one of the other BRIC countries, BRIC being Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And the country I would probably do is Brazil. There's China, 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 China. There's a vast amount of research. India is relatively under-researched. Brazil is definitely under-researched. Russia, to be honest, not that many people seem to care about. And I'm going to talk a little about the BRIC later on. Speaking of globalization, to show what a small world it is, I was in India for the entire month of November, and I had been interviewing Canadian and Indian executives here, and I was sitting in the office of a woman named Shirley Townsend, who's Ontario's representative. She's actually in the embassy in New Delhi, and she was saying, "How are your interviews going?" And I said, "Well, they're going pretty well, but some people are hard to get a hold of." And she said, "Well, who would that be?" And I said, "Well, even from my days at the Globe and Mail, I know that, Magna never liked to talk to the journalists and, don't seem to be very forthcoming on my project." And I see there's another company called RV Anderson that is doing, they're actually redoing the wastewater system in Mumbai, a huge job. And I'd contacted the CEO a number of times. His name's Ken Morrison, never heard anything back. This is in New Delhi, the very day I arrived. And she said, "Well, would you like to meet him?" And I said, "Of course I'd like to meet him." And she said, "Well, do you want me to go get him? He's in the next office." And I said, "What's he doing in the next office?" And she said, "Oh, he's on a trade mission." So she lugs this guy in, who looked kind of shamefaced because he hadn't been answering my emails. And I said, "Oh, Mr. Morrison, great to see you. When can we have an interview?" So I trapped him. So I was very pleased that took place. The study I did basically was based on the idea that people for years have said Canada and India should be natural partners, but they never have been. Much of that is because of the nuclear question, which I'll talk about a little later. And trade is not what it's been. Investment between the two countries has not been what it's been. So I said, well, has anyone actually talked to Canadians that have gone, Canadian companies that have gone to India and been successful? Nobody had. So what I ended up doing was talking to people from Scotiabank that have been there for 20 years, people from Royal Bank that's setting up there, people from Brookfield Asset Management, which is an $80 billion Canadian company that now have someone there, 30 or 40 or 50 different Canadian companies and looked at their experience of what is it like to set up a business in India, what are the problems, what are the opportunities, how do you deal with the government, what would you like our government to do, and what's the business culture like there? I mean, how do you work deals? How bad is corruption? You have to pay people off. And all of this was done on the record, which no one else has done. And I've got great stories in this study that I hope will soon be published by the CIC about people being offered bribes and how they react, and all kinds of stories. I was amazed at the candor of so many people on subjects that are normally considered very sensitive. I would say the good news is there's a lot of interest in India. I was surprised. I've spoken at, in the last 6 or 8 weeks at McGill University.